please. You spent your own fuel, your car broke down, you deserve this.
I returned your wallet. I didn't sell it back to you.
At 9:47 p.m., Margaret Wilson stood beside her aging Ford Taurus, staring at the gas needle trembling just above empty. In one hand was a worn prescription receipt for her father's Parkinson's medication. In the other was a leather wallet she had found beneath a shopping cart stuffed with cash, an old silver coin engraved with a single sentence and a faded photograph of a smiling elderly woman. 40 miles separated her from the wallet's owner, and she barely had enough fuel to get there. Across the parking lot, a black SUV remained parked with its headlights off, someone silently watching the choice she was about to make. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. If heartfelt stories about ordinary people making extraordinary choices mean something to you, consider subscribing and joining us for more. Margaret Wilson's alarm rang every morning at exactly 4:55 a.m., 5 minutes before the old digital clock on her nightstand would begin flashing because of its loose power cord. She always reached over to silence it before the second beep. Not because she was afraid of waking herself, but because the sound often startled her father. The little house on East Weber Road had belonged to her grandparents long before Columbus had spread towards the surrounding neighborhoods. Time had left its fingerprints everywhere. The hardwood floor groaned beneath careful footsteps. The kitchen faucet needed to be turned twice before it stopped dripping. Every winter, cold air slipped through the edges of the windows no matter how many towels Margaret tucked beneath them. She quietly pulled on her faded blue supermarket polo and tied her brown hair into a neat ponytail before walking toward the kitchen. The coffee maker, older than some of the cashiers she worked with, coughed and sputtered before filling the room with the familiar smell that made the mornings feel less lonely. A gentle shuffle came from the hallway. Her father appeared one careful step after another. Thomas Wilson had once been known as the mechanic who could diagnose an engine just by listening to it idle. Neighbors used to joke that he understood cars better than doctors understood people. Now his hands trembled before he even reached the table. "Morning, Maggie," he said, forcing the same cheerful smile he had worn for years. She smiled back. "Morning, Dad." He reached for the coffee mug with both hands. The shaking had become worse over the past 6 months, though he insisted it hadn't. "I'm getting old," he always said. Margaret knew better. Parkinson's disease had slowly stolen the confidence from the man who had once rebuilt an entire pickup truck inside their garage. Yet every morning he acted as though nothing had changed. "You don't have to work overtime tonight," Thomas said. "I'll be fine." Margaret buttered 2 slices of toast. "We've talked about this." "I know." "You need your medication." "I still have enough." She looked toward the orange prescription bottle on the counter. There were exactly 3 pills left. Enough until tomorrow morning. No more. She had already counted twice before leaving for work yesterday. Thomas noticed her glance and quietly turned the bottle so the label faced away. He hated when she worried. She hated pretending she didn't. Breakfast was simple. Toast, scrambled eggs. 1 sliced apple shared between them. Margaret had become remarkably skilled at stretching groceries farther than anyone thought possible. She clipped coupons, compared prices, bought store brands, cooked nearly every meal from scratch. She even froze leftover bread before it spoiled. Every dollar had a destination before it ever reached her wallet. After breakfast, she grabbed a small spiral notebook from the kitchen drawer. Its cover had faded from navy blue to gray after years of use. Every page contained neat handwriting: gas, groceries, medicine, electric bill, insurance. She wrote every expense. Not because she enjoyed accounting, because surprises had become luxuries she couldn't afford. Today's balance sat at $28.43 until payday. She underlined the number once, then closed the notebook. Thomas watched quietly. "You know," he said softly, "your mother would have told you to stop worrying so much." Margaret smiled without looking up. "No." She would have said worrying doesn't pay bills. Thomas laughed. "That's true." Then his smile slowly disappeared. "But she also would have told you that you've carried this family long enough." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "We're carrying it together." She kissed his forehead before grabbing her keys. Outside, her silver 2004 Ford Taurus waited beneath a maple tree that had begun dropping early autumn leaves across the hood. The paint had faded. The rear bumper carried a crack from a minor accident years ago. The driver's window only rolled down halfway. The air conditioner worked when it felt generous. The engine always needed 2 attempts before starting. Margaret patted the dashboard gently. "Come on, old girl." The engine coughed, stopped. She smiled. "One more." The second try finally brought it to life. Her father stepped onto the porch despite the morning chill. He always waited until she backed out of the driveway. Always waved, always smiled. It was another one of his routines. Margaret never drove away until she saw him wave first. Some habits became silent promises. The drive to Oak Ridge Market took nearly 25 minutes. Rush hour traffic slowly thickened. School buses appeared. Construction crews filled gas stations with bright orange safety vests. Margaret parked in the employee lot exactly 15 minutes early, just as she always did. Daniel Brooks was already unlocking the front entrance. He glanced at his watch. "You're early again." "I thought I was on time." "You always think that." He smiled. "I've been managing this place 12 years. I don't think I've ever seen you late." Margaret shrugged. "My mother hated being late." "I figured." Daniel handed her a new stack of sale tags. "The cereal aisle first." "You got it." By 7 o'clock, the automatic doors opened. Customers flooded inside, parents grabbing breakfast before work, retirees comparing coupons, construction workers buying coffee, college students looking half asleep. Margaret greeted every person with the same calm warmth. "Good morning." "How are you today?" "Paper or plastic?" some customers answered. Some never looked at her face. Some scrolled through their phones while she scanned groceries. Others complained because milk cost 30 cents more than last week, as though she had personally raised the price. She apologized anyway. Near noon, an elderly woman struggled to count change with arthritic fingers. The line behind her grew impatient. A man sighed loudly. Another checked his watch. Margaret simply waited. "No rush," she said gently. "Take your time." The woman looked up with watery eyes. "Thank you. My hands don't move very fast anymore." Margaret smiled. "That's okay. We'll get there." After the woman finally left, Rebecca Hayes leaned over from the next register. "You have the patience of a saint." Margaret laughed. "No. I just know everyone is fighting something." Rebecca shook her head. "I wish more people thought like that." The afternoon passed in a blur of barcodes and shopping bags. At exactly 3:15 p.m., Margaret quietly stepped into the employee break room. Inside her lunchbox sat a turkey sandwich she had made before sunrise. Beside it rested a folded piece of paper. It wasn't a note. It was another grocery coupon. She smiled. Thomas must have slipped it into her lunch before she left. Even now, he still wanted to help. She carefully folded it back into her notebook. Above one page was something written years earlier in different handwriting. It wasn't hers. It belonged to Sarah Wilson. The ink had faded, but the words remained clear. "People may remember what you owned for a little while. They'll remember who you were for much longer." Margaret gently traced the sentence with her fingertip. She had read it hundreds of times. Every difficult decision in her life somehow led back to those words. She closed the notebook unaware that before the night was over, those same words would quietly guide her toward a choice that would change far more than she could possibly imagine. While Margaret Wilson spent her afternoon smiling at strangers who rarely remembered her name, Charles Bennett spent his surrounded by people who rarely spoke to him without calculating what they might gain. The headquarters of Bennett Freight Logistics stood 23 floors above downtown Columbus, its glass exterior reflecting the gray October sky. Inside the executive conference room, polished oak tables and oversized digital displays projected charts, forecasts, and quarterly earnings that would have sounded impressive to anyone outside the room. Charles barely looked at them. His attention rested on a slim folder lying closed beside his hand. Across the table, nearly 20 executives waited for him to speak. No one dared interrupt the silence. Finally, Charles opened the folder. Inside were copies of invoices, altered contracts, and emails that stretched back almost 18 months. He closed it again. I trusted him. His voice remained calm, almost too calm. No one answered. The former chief financial officer had resigned 3 days earlier after investigators uncovered a sophisticated scheme that had quietly diverted company funds through shell vendors and fake consulting agreements. The financial loss was significant. The betrayal mattered more. Charles leaned back. 22 years. He looked around the room. I worked beside that man for 22 years. Another silence. Then Noah Bennett cleared his throat. Charles's only son sat 2 chairs away, 40 years old, tailored navy suit, perfect posture. An expensive watch peeked from beneath his cuff. Unlike his father, Noah had earned an MBA before joining the family business. He was brilliant with numbers, efficient with people, and emotionally cautious. He believed business worked best when trust was replaced with verification. "Dad," Noah said carefully, "this wasn't your fault." Charles gave a tired smile. "No, it was." Noah frowned. "You couldn't have known. I chose to believe character mattered more than contracts. And now," Charles looked toward the rain, streaking the conference room windows. "Now, I think contracts matter because character doesn't." Several executives quietly lowered their eyes. No one challenged him. The meeting continued for another hour. New security procedures, additional audits, more oversight, more signatures, more passwords, more suspicion. When it finally ended, Charles remained seated long after everyone else had left. Only Noah stayed behind. "You should go home," Noah said. Charles looked toward the empty chair where his former CFO had sat for years. "Home." He almost laughed. "I spend less time there than anyone. You could change that." "No. I built this company, and now I spend every day wondering who's stealing from it." Noah stood quietly. "People disappoint you. They always have." Charles finally rose from his chair. "They disappoint themselves first." Father and son walked through the quiet executive floor together. Employees greeted them respectfully. "Good afternoon, Mr. Bennett." "Good evening, sir." Charles nodded politely. Yet he noticed something different now. Every smile looked rehearsed. Every compliment sounded practiced. Every handshake felt lighter than it used to. Once suspicion entered the heart, it colored everything. By 6:30 that evening, Charles dismissed his driver. "I'll take the car." His security coordinator looked surprised. "Sir, I need groceries. We can send someone." Charles shook his head. "I remember how to buy milk." The coordinator didn't argue. Charles drove himself for the first time in weeks. Not because he enjoyed shopping, because ordinary places reminded him life still existed outside conference rooms. He entered Oak Ridge Market wearing a dark jacket and a plain baseball cap. Most customers paid him no attention. He preferred it that way. He picked up eggs, whole grain bread, coffee beans, fresh tomatoes, chicken soup, a frozen apple pie he had no real intention of eating. He wandered the aisles without rushing, watching families argue over cereal, children begging for candy, an elderly couple comparing soup labels, a teenage employee laughing while stocking shelves. The ordinary rhythm of life felt strangely comforting. No one here cared about stock prices. No one cared about executive titles. To them, he was simply another customer pushing a shopping cart. As he reached checkout lane 4, Margaret was helping another customer with an overflowing cart. Charles quietly joined the line. He noticed her immediately, not because she recognized him. She didn't. Not because she smiled. Nearly every cashier smiled. It was the way she treated the elderly woman ahead of him. The woman apologized repeatedly for paying with coupons. "I'm sorry I'm holding everyone up." Margaret smiled gently. "You're saving money." "I think that's smart." The woman laughed nervously. "My grandchildren think coupons are embarrassing." "They've never paid electric bills." The woman smiled wider. Charles found himself smiling too. When his turn arrived, Margaret greeted him exactly as she had greeted everyone else. "Good evening. Did you find everything you needed?" "I believe so." Her movements were practiced, smooth, unhurried. She carefully wrapped the tomatoes separately from heavier items, placed eggs on top, double-bagged the soup. Small details. Details most people never noticed. "Your total comes to $74.12. Charles handed over his credit card. As she processed the payment, another customer accidentally dropped a bottle nearby. The loud crash echoed across several checkout lanes. Margaret instinctively turned her head. Charles glanced in the same direction. It lasted only 2 seconds, maybe 3. Then the receipt printed. "Here you are." He signed electronically, collected his grocery bags. "Thank you. Have a wonderful evening." "You too." He walked outside carrying 2 reusable bags. The October wind had grown colder. Leaves scattered across the parking lot. Charles unlocked his black SUV, loaded the groceries, and drove away without noticing that his leather wallet had slipped from the pocket of his jacket while he bent over to place the bags inside. The wallet landed beneath the neighboring shopping cart. Invisible. 10 minutes later, another customer pushed the cart away. The wallet remained where it had fallen. People hurried past. Shoes stepped within inches of it. Shopping carts rolled around it. No one looked down. Back at home, Charles carried his groceries into a house far larger than one man needed. The Bennett estate had once been full of laughter. Holiday dinners, birthday parties, his late wife's piano music drifting through open windows. Now, only silence greeted him. He placed the groceries neatly in the kitchen, started the coffee maker, loosened his tie, then reached into his jacket pocket. Nothing. He checked the other pocket. Still nothing. The kitchen suddenly felt much colder. He searched the dining room, the living room, his office, the garage. Nothing. His heartbeat accelerated. No. He walked back to the SUV carrying a flashlight. Every seat. Under every floor mat. Inside every compartment. Nothing. The realization struck harder than he expected. His wallet wasn't valuable because of the money. There were perhaps $3,000 in cash, several credit cards, his driver's license. Those could all be replaced. What couldn't be replaced was the photograph. A faded picture taken 31 years earlier. His mother standing outside their tiny farmhouse laughing while holding his hand. It was the last photograph ever taken of her before cancer claimed her life. Folded behind the photograph rested an old silver coin. On one side was an eagle. On the other were 7 engraved words his mother had once repeated so often he could still hear her voice. Character is what you carry when nobody is watching. She had given him the coin the day he started his first trucking job with one old pickup and more determination than money. He had carried it every day since. Not because it was valuable, because it reminded him of who he wanted to become. Charles immediately called Noah. I lost my wallet. Where? I don't know. What was inside? Charles closed his eyes. Everything that matters. The automatic doors of Oak Ridge Market slid shut with a soft hiss as the final customer disappeared into the chilly October night. A recorded voice echoed through the nearly empty store. Oak Ridge Market is now closed. Thank you for shopping with us. Margaret Wilson exhaled slowly. Her feet throbbed after 10 straight hours behind Register 4. She reached down to untie the apron around her waist, folded it into a neat square, and placed it inside her locker exactly the way she did every evening. Small routines made difficult days feel manageable. Daniel Brooks wheeled a cart stacked with tomorrow's sale signs past the employee lockers. Long day, Margaret smiled. They're all long lately. You heading straight home? My dad will probably be watching through the front window by now. Daniel chuckled. He still waits up every night, every single one. Tell him I said hello. I will. She grabbed her lunch container from the break room refrigerator. Half of her turkey sandwich remained untouched. She wrapped it carefully in wax paper. Thomas always insisted leftovers deserved a second chance. So do people, he often said. Outside the parking lot felt much larger now that almost every car had gone home. Wind pushed dry maple leaves across the asphalt in restless circles beneath the bright parking lot lights. Margaret unlocked her aging silver Ford Taurus with the key instead of the remote. The remote had stopped working nearly a year ago, and replacing the battery had somehow never become a priority. Just as she reached for the driver's door, she heard the squeak of metal wheels. A shopping cart drifted across the parking lot, carried by the wind toward a black pickup truck. She hurried after it. If you leave a dent tonight, somebody's going to have a bad morning. She caught the cart just before it bumped the truck's bumper. As she turned it around, something beneath its front wheel caught her attention. A dark leather wallet. It had been partially hidden beneath a scattering of yellow leaves. Margaret bent down. The leather was worn smooth from years of use. Not fashionable, not flashy, simply well cared for. She looked around the parking lot. No one searching between vehicles. No one calling out. No headlights circling back. The wallet felt unusually heavy when she picked it up. Instead of opening it outside, she carried it beneath the entrance lights where several security cameras overlooked the doorway. Only then did she slowly unfold it. Rows of crisp $100 bills filled one compartment. Credit cards, insurance cards, a driver's license, business cards, everything organized with remarkable precision. Margaret stared for several seconds before forcing herself to breathe normally. She had never held that much cash, not in her entire life. She reached for the driver's license. Charles Edward Bennett. The face looked familiar. She closed her eyes for a moment. Soup, bread, eggs, coffee, apple pie. Register 4. The quiet gentleman who had thanked her before leaving. She opened one of the business cards. Charles Bennett, Chairman, Bennett Freight Logistics. Even someone who rarely watched the news knew the Bennett name. Their trucks traveled nearly every interstate in Ohio. She quietly whispered to herself, "So, it's really yours." As she carefully returned the driver's license, something metallic slipped into her palm. A silver coin, older than anything else inside the wallet. Its edges had been polished smooth by decades of handling. She turned it over. Character is what you carry when nobody is watching. The words lingered in her mind, not because they sounded unfamiliar, because they sounded almost exactly like something her mother used to say. When nobody can see your choice, Sarah Wilson often reminded her daughter, that's when your character introduces itself. Margaret smiled sadly. Her mother had been gone for almost 9 years. Some evenings it still felt impossible to believe. She carefully placed the coin back where she had found it. Then she noticed a photograph tucked behind it. Curiosity tempted her. She hesitated. Finally, she lifted it only enough to see the image. A younger Charles Bennett stood beside an elderly woman outside a white farmhouse. They weren't looking at the camera. They were laughing at each other, real laughter, the kind that couldn't be staged. Margaret turned the photograph over. In faded blue handwriting were 4 simple words, "Always carry your heart." She returned it immediately. Some things deserved privacy. Rebecca Hayes pushed through the entrance carrying her purse over one shoulder. Maggie. "You still here?" Margaret looked up. "I found something." Rebecca stepped closer. Her eyes widened. "That's one expensive-looking wallet. It belongs to Charles Bennett." Rebecca blinked. "The billionaire?" "I think so." Rebecca glanced inside. "Oh my goodness. There's enough cash in there to buy my car." Margaret laughed softly. "Your car's worth more than you think." Rebecca shook her head. "What are you going to do?" "I haven't decided. Seems easy to me." "Call the police tomorrow." Daniel joined them carrying a trash bag. "What's easy?" Rebecca pointed. "Our honest friend just found a fortune." Daniel examined the driver's license. "Charles Bennett." He let out a low whistle. "Well, store policy says found property goes into the office safe. We'll contact the owner tomorrow morning." Margaret nodded. "I know." Daniel noticed she didn't sound convinced. "You have another idea." She looked toward the photograph resting inside the wallet. "I think someone is probably looking for this right now." Rebecca crossed her arms. "So? They'll still be looking tomorrow." Margaret remained silent. Daniel gently asked, "Why tonight?" Margaret thought for a moment before answering. "Because if my father lost the last photograph of my mother, I wouldn't want someone waiting until tomorrow." The room became quiet. Daniel understood immediately. Rebecca looked down. Neither argued. Margaret searched the wallet again for a phone number. Nothing. Only business cards and the residential address printed on the driver's license. She entered it into her phone. 40 miles. Her shoulders slowly dropped. 40 miles north, then 40 miles back. She already knew her fuel tank couldn't comfortably make that trip. Her phone vibrated. Medication reminder. Thomas Wilson. Prescription pickup before 8:00 a.m. She quietly opened her banking app. Available balance. $28.43, enough for gasoline. Or enough for tomorrow's medication. Probably not both. The arithmetic felt cruel. Her phone rang. "Dad," she answered. "Hi. You heading home?" "Oh, I'm about to." "You sound different?" Margaret smiled. "You always know." "I've been your father for 33 years. She laughed quietly. "I found someone's wallet. I guessed it was something like that." "You did?" You only get that thoughtful voice when your conscience is working overtime. She leaned against the wall. "It's 40 miles away." Thomas remained silent for several seconds. Then he asked one question. "What would your mother do?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. She already knew Sarah Wilson would have put on her coat, started the car, and driven every mile without mentioning the inconvenience once. Thomas seemed to hear the answer in the silence. That's what I thought. After hanging up, Margaret stood motionless. A memory returned with astonishing clarity. She had been 11, walking beside her mother after Sunday church. An envelope filled with rent money had been lying beside the sidewalk. Young Margaret had whispered, "Maybe we should keep it." Sarah had smiled gently. "If we keep it." Someone else goes home crying tonight. They had spent almost 3 hours knocking on doors until they found the elderly widow who had lost it. The woman hugged Sarah so tightly that neither of them could speak. Margaret never forgot that embrace. She looked toward the parking lot where her old Ford Taurus waited beneath the lights. The fuel gauge might disagree with her decision. Her bank account certainly would, but deep inside she already knew what she had to do. She signed the store's property log accepting responsibility for transporting the wallet. Daniel handed it back. "I can't officially tell you to drive there," he paused. "But I hope, wherever this ends, you get home safely." Rebecca sighed. "Text me when you get back." "I will." Margaret placed the wallet carefully on the passenger seat. Beside it lay her father's prescription receipt. For a long moment she stared at both. One represented everything her family desperately needed. The other represented everything another family might be desperately missing. She turned the ignition. The old engine coughed once, twice, then settled into its familiar uneven idle. Margaret rested both hands on the steering wheel. "Come on, old girl," she whispered. "We've got 40 miles to drive." The headlights cut through the darkness as the Taurus rolled slowly toward the highway carrying a woman who had almost nothing of value except the one thing she refused to lose. The old Ford Taurus merged onto Interstate 71 with a reluctant growl, its engine protesting every increase in speed. Margaret Wilson rested both hands on the steering wheel, listening carefully to every vibration coming through the worn leather cover her father had stitched years ago. "Easy," she whispered to the car. "We've done harder things." The dashboard clock changed from 9:58 to 9:59. The fuel gauge hovered so close to empty that the needle seemed afraid to move. She knew exactly how much gasoline remained because she had calculated it twice before leaving work. Under perfect conditions, she might have enough to reach Charles Bennett's address. Getting back home would be another question entirely. The orange prescription receipt for her father's medication rested beside the wallet on the passenger seat. Every few minutes her eyes drifted toward it. Not because she questioned returning the wallet. She questioned whether she had planned well enough to do both. The highway stretched ahead in long ribbons of pale concrete illuminated by scattered streetlights. Most of the traffic consisted of freight trucks making overnight deliveries between Ohio cities. Their engines rumbled steadily, creating a comforting rhythm against the silence inside Margaret's car. One blue and silver trailer passed on her left. Bennett Freight Logistics. She watched it disappear into the darkness. The name suddenly felt less like the logo of a giant corporation, and more like the name of a man who might be pacing across his living room, searching every pocket of every coat he owned. She imagined him retracing his steps. Kitchen, driveway, garage, the grocery store. Then the realization. The wallet. She wondered if he had already canceled his credit cards. Probably. Most people would. Money could be protected. Memories couldn't. A cold draft slipped through the driver's side window seal. Margaret rubbed her hands together for warmth before returning them to the wheel. The heater had stopped producing truly warm air sometime last winter. It still made noise. It simply no longer made much heat. Her father had promised to fix it. Then the tremors in his hands had become too noticeable. He had quietly stopped making promises after that. The thought brought another memory rushing back. She was 16 years old, standing beside Thomas in the tiny garage behind their house. The Taurus had belonged to someone else back then. "It's ugly," teenage Margaret had complained. Thomas laughed. "It is. It's old, definitely. Why are we buying it?" He wiped grease from his hands with an old towel. "Because ugly cars still take good people where they need to go." She remembered rolling her eyes. Years later, she understood that her father had never been talking about the car. A bright sign announced the next service plaza. Gas, coffee, restrooms. Margaret instinctively eased off the accelerator. The digital price board came into view, $3.94 a gallon. She looked at the fuel gauge, then at the wallet, then at her own bank balance displayed in her memory, $28.43. If she bought enough fuel now, she would almost certainly need to delay picking up part of her father's medication until after work tomorrow. She drove past the exit. The service plaza disappeared in her rearview mirror. "I'll figure it out," she murmured. The words sounded less convincing than she intended. Her phone chimed through the car's Bluetooth system. Low battery. She plugged it into the charging cable that only worked if held at exactly the right angle. The screen lit up again. No missed calls. No messages. She wondered whether Charles Bennett had a family waiting with him, a wife, children, grandchildren. Someone was probably worried. Not about the money, about him. The wallet had looked too personal to belong to a man who carried it only out of convenience. She thought again about the faded photograph. There had been joy in that picture, unposed, unfiltered. The elderly woman's smile reminded Margaret of her own mother. Not because they looked alike, because they both seemed to possess the rare ability to make whoever stood beside them feel completely seen. Her grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel. The memory of Sarah Wilson arrived without invitation. It had been another autumn evening. Margaret was 13. Rain had soaked both of them as they hurried toward their old house carrying grocery bags. Halfway home, Sarah stopped. A leather glove lay in the gutter. "Just one." Margaret laughed. "Who keeps one glove?" Her mother picked it up anyway. What if the other one's waiting? Sure enough, 20 feet farther down the sidewalk lay its partner. Margaret had laughed even harder. Her mother smiled. Sometimes people only find what they're willing to stop for. At the time, it had sounded like another one of Sarah's harmless sayings. Now, driving through the darkness with another person's wallet beside her, Margaret finally understood. The world moved too quickly. Most people never stopped. Another freight truck overtook her. Its headlights briefly filled the Taurus before disappearing ahead. The turbulence rocked her aging car. The steering wheel vibrated. Then the engine gave a small cough. Margaret immediately glanced at the gauges. Temperature normal, oil pressure steady, check engine light off. She listened carefully. The idle sounded rougher than before. "Don't do this tonight." The car continued forward. For another 5 miles, nothing happened. Then the fuel warning light illuminated. A soft chime echoed once inside the cabin. Margaret smiled without humor. "I noticed." She'd switched off the heater completely. The cabin immediately grew colder. Every little bit of fuel mattered now. She also eased her speed down from 65 to 58. Her father always claimed older engines appreciated patience. As if on cue, the vibration lessened. "Thanks, Dad," she smiled to herself. Nearly 30 minutes into the drive, her phone rang. Dad appeared on the screen. She accepted the call. "You should be asleep." Thomas chuckled. "You know better." "I do." "Where are you?" "About halfway." A brief silence followed. Then he asked the question she had expected. "How's the car?" "It'll make it." "And the gas?" Margaret hesitated just long enough. Thomas sighed. "So, not great. I'll be okay. I wish I could still fix that old thing. You fixed it enough times already. I suppose. His voice softened. You remember what your mother used to say before long drives? Margaret smiled. Leave with a clear heart. And come home with one, too. That's right. She blinked away unexpected tears. I miss her. So do I. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, Thomas said quietly, I'm proud of you. Margaret swallowed hard. I haven't done anything yet. You left the house. That was enough. The call ended. Outside, the moon emerged from behind thick clouds, washing the empty fields with pale silver light. The highway signs indicated 12 miles remained before her exit. Margaret relaxed slightly. Maybe the old Taurus would make it after all. She reached over and gently adjusted the wallet after it shifted during a curve. As she did, the silver coin slipped from its pocket and landed softly on the seat. She picked it up at the next red light near an interchange. The engraved words caught the glow of the traffic signal. Character is what you carry when nobody is watching. She traced the sentence once with her thumb before placing the coin exactly where it belonged. Then the traffic light turned green. Margaret accelerated gently. A mile later, the Taurus suddenly jerked. The engine stumbled once, recovered, then stumbled again. A yellow warning light blinked on the dashboard. Margaret's heartbeat quickened. Oh, please. She eased the car into the right lane as another Bennett freight logistics truck rolled steadily past, its taillights fading into the darkness ahead. The yellow warning light stayed on. Margaret Wilson loosened her grip on the steering wheel just enough to keep herself from overreacting. Panic had never repaired an engine, and her father had spent years teaching her that the first rule of dealing with machines was the same as dealing with people. Listen before you act. She lowered the radio volume even though it was already off. The Taurus spoke in its own language. The engine still pulled. The vibration had become more noticeable. A faint metallic rattle appeared whenever she pressed the accelerator too hard. She eased her speed down to 55. That's better, she whispered. For a moment, the sound settled into something almost normal. She allowed herself one slow breath, then another. Miles away, Charles Bennett stood barefoot in the middle of his kitchen, staring at the empty space on the granite countertop where he had already searched 3 times. His wallet wasn't there. Neither was it in the pantry, or beside the coffee machine, or on the dining table. He had searched every room with the growing desperation of someone hoping reality might change simply because he refused to accept it. Noah Bennett entered from the study holding a tablet. I've frozen every card. Charles nodded absently. Good. I also contacted the bank. Another nod. And building security reviewed today's cameras. Charles finally looked up. Anything? No. You definitely had the wallet when you left for your meeting. And after that, we're still checking. Charles walked toward the living room window. Outside, the lights of the estate reflected across the quiet pond behind the house. His home covered nearly 20 acres. Tonight it felt strangely empty. Noah watched his father carefully. Dad. It was just a wallet. Charles gave him a tired smile. No, it wasn't. Noah already knew what came next. The photograph. Charles nodded. And the coin. He reached into his jacket pocket out of habit. Empty. When your grandmother gave me that coin, I had exactly $187 to my name. Noah had heard the story before, dozens of times. But tonight it sounded different. I carried it through every business failure, every loan rejection, every contract, every funeral. Charles's voice grew quieter. I never imagined I'd lose it in a grocery store. Noah stepped closer. We'll find it. Charles looked unconvinced. You have more faith than I do. I have security cameras. His father almost laughed. No, you have technology. What finds lost things is still people. The irony escaped neither of them. At that same moment, Margaret drove beneath an overhead sign announcing only 7 miles to her exit. She smiled. So far, so good. Almost immediately, the engine stumbled again, this time harder. The steering wheel shook. A small warning chime sounded. She instinctively switched off the headlights for half a second before realizing what she had done and immediately turned them back on. Her pulse quickened. The car continued moving. "Stay with me." Another mile passed. Then another. The vibration eased again. Margaret thought about turning around. She even imagined the route back to Oak Ridge Market. She could leave the wallet with the police. Call the number on the business card tomorrow. Everything would still be technically correct. But every time that thought appeared, another image replaced it. The faded photograph. Always carry your heart. She couldn't explain why those 4 words affected her so deeply. Perhaps because the handwriting reminded her of the birthday cards her mother used to write. Large letters, slightly slanted, full of warmth. Her phone buzzed against the dashboard. "Rebecca." Margaret answered through Bluetooth. "Hey, are you crazy?" Margaret laughed. "I've been asked that before." "I'm serious. I've been thinking. That's usually dangerous." Rebecca sighed. "I looked up Charles Bennett." "So? He's worth hundreds of millions." "I know. He'll survive until tomorrow." Margaret glanced toward the wallet. "I'm not sure that's what he's missing." Rebecca became quiet. "You really think it's the picture? I think everybody has something money can't replace." Rebecca didn't answer for several seconds. Finally, she said softly, "You sound exactly like your mom." Margaret smiled. "I hope that's a compliment." "It is. I'll stop worrying." "No, I won't, but text me when you're done. I promise." The call ended. Margaret noticed another sign. Exit 142, 2 miles. She relaxed slightly. The difficult part of the drive was almost over. Back at the Bennett estate, Noah's phone rang. He answered immediately. "Yes." A pause. "What did they say?" Another pause. "They're checking the grocery store." Charles turned toward him hopefully. Noah covered the phone. "Store security is reviewing parking lot footage." Charles waited. His expression betrayed nothing. Years of negotiating had taught him to hide disappointment, but inside hope fought cautiously against experience. Noah listened another minute before ending the call. "They haven't found anything yet." Charles closed his eyes. "I see. You should get some rest. I'll sleep when I know." Noah hesitated. "Dad, if someone returns it, would you trust them?" Charles answered without hesitation. "I'd thank them. And then I'd wonder why." The words lingered in the room long after they were spoken. Charles heard himself. He realized how bitter they sounded. There had once been a time when he would have answered differently. Before lawsuits, before betrayals, before boardroom politics, before learning that generosity often attracted manipulation. He walked toward the fireplace. Above it hung another photograph of his mother, taken years after the one inside the wallet. She was older, thinner, already sick. Yet she was smiling. She had always smiled. "People will disappoint you," she used to tell him. "But don't make the mistake of believing people are disappointment." At the time, he hadn't understood the difference. Now, he wasn't sure he still believed it. Meanwhile, Margaret exited the interstate and followed a narrow 2-lane road lined with oak trees. The houses grew farther apart. Mailboxes appeared every few hundred yards. The GPS announced, "Continue for 5 miles." She glanced once more at the fuel gauge. The needle rested below empty now. The warning light glowed steadily. Her stomach tightened. Just a little farther, the Taurus answered with another rough cough. Then the headlights dimmed for the briefest instant. Margaret immediately switched off the heater fan, though it had barely been producing warmth. Every bit of electrical power suddenly seemed precious. The road curved through open farmland. In the distance, she noticed a line of trucks parked behind a large maintenance facility. Every trailer carried the same blue and silver Bennett Freight Logistics logo. She had arrived in the right place. At least almost. Her GPS announced, "In 1 mile, turn right." Margaret smiled with relief. Then, without warning, the engine lost power. Not completely. Just enough for her foot on the accelerator to feel strangely disconnected. The Taurus slowed, recovered, then shuddered violently. A harsh grinding noise echoed beneath the hood. Margaret's heartbeat slammed against her ribs. Oh no! She guided the car toward the shoulder just as the dashboard lights flickered once. Ahead, less than a mile away, she could already see the entrance gate to the Bennett estate glowing beneath elegant stone lanterns. Margaret eased the Taurus onto the gravel shoulder, just as the engine gave one last violent shudder. The headlights dimmed. The steering wheel became heavy beneath her hands. Then everything fell quiet, except for the ticking sound of hot metal cooling beneath the hood. She closed her eyes for a moment. "Thank you," she whispered to the old car. "You got us here." The entrance to the Bennett estate stood less than half a mile ahead. Tall stone pillars framed a black wrought iron gate bearing a bronze plaque. Bennett Farm. The name surprised her. She had expected a modern mansion with polished gates and marble statues. Instead, beyond the entrance, she could see wide-open fields, rows of old oak trees, and the silhouette of a restored, white farmhouse sitting farther back on a gentle hill. It looked expensive, certainly, but it also looked lived in. She tried starting the Taurus again. The starter clicked once, twice. Nothing. She tried again. Only silence answered. Margaret rested both hands on the steering wheel. She could call a tow truck. She could call Rebecca. She could even call her father. Instead, she looked toward the passenger seat. Charles Bennett's wallet rested exactly where she had placed it. She picked it up carefully. "I've come this far." She slipped the wallet into her canvas tote bag, locked the Taurus, and began walking toward the entrance. The October wind carried the scent of freshly cut hay and damp earth. Gravel crunched beneath her worn sneakers. Each step reminded her how tired she really was. 10 hours standing behind a cash register. Nearly an hour driving. Now another half-mile on foot. Still, she kept walking. The gatehouse lights flickered on before she reached them. A security guard stepped outside. He was broad-shouldered, perhaps in his early 50s, wearing a dark jacket with Bennett Security embroidered across the chest. "Evening, ma'am." "Can I help you?" Margaret smiled politely. "I hope so. I found something that belongs to Mr. Bennett." The guard looked at her canvas bag. "What exactly? A wallet?" His expression changed immediately. "One moment." His hand instinctively moved toward the radio clipped to his belt. "I'm going to need you to stay right there." "Of course." She stopped several feet from the gate. The guard spoke quietly into his radio. Margaret couldn't hear the response. After a minute, he looked back at her. "Your name?" "Margaret Wilson." "Do you work for Mr. Bennett?" "No." "Have you met him before tonight?" "I checked him out at my register this evening." The guard studied her face carefully. "You drove all the way here?" "Yes." "In that car?" Margaret turned toward the dark road behind her. It stopped running. The guard followed her gaze. He could barely make out the outline of the old Taurus parked on the shoulder. "You walked?" "Yes." For the first time, suspicion gave way to curiosity. "You could have mailed it." "I didn't think he'd want to wait." The guard remained silent. He pressed the radio button again. "This is Frank. She says she found the wallet." Another pause. "Yes. Everything appears intact." Another long silence. Finally, he nodded. "I understand." He looked back at Margaret. "Mr. Bennett wasn't planning to receive visitors tonight. I understand. But he's willing to see you." Relief washed across her face. "Thank you." The gates opened slowly with a low mechanical hum. Frank motioned for her to follow. "I'll drive you. You don't need to walk the rest of the way." Margaret hesitated. "My car? We'll deal with it later." She climbed into the security vehicle. As they drove along the winding private road, she noticed something unexpected. The property wasn't filled with luxury sports cars or elaborate fountains. Instead, there were restored barns, horse pastures, a small lake, and dozens of mature maple trees glowing orange beneath landscape lights. It felt peaceful. Frank noticed her looking around. Surprised, a little. Everybody expects a palace. It isn't. It used to belong to Mr. Bennett's parents. He rebuilt it instead of tearing it down. Margaret looked toward the farmhouse. He must have loved this place. Frank smiled. He never really left it. A few minutes later, they stopped in front of the main house. Warm yellow light spilled from the windows. Someone had placed pumpkins along the stone walkway. The front porch held 2 old wooden rocking chairs instead of expensive outdoor furniture. Margaret suddenly felt nervous. Frank led her inside. The foyer smelled faintly of cedar and fresh coffee. Family photographs lined the walls. Children, graduations, fishing trips, military uniforms, ordinary moments. Nothing looked staged. Frank gestured toward a sitting room. "If you'll wait here, I'll let him know." Margaret nodded. She remained standing. A fire crackled quietly in the stone fireplace. Above it hung another photograph of the same elderly woman she had seen inside the wallet. The resemblance was unmistakable. His mother. A few moments later, footsteps echoed from the hallway. Charles Bennett entered wearing dark slacks and a simple gray sweater. Without the business suit, he looked older than Margaret remembered. More tired. His eyes immediately settled on the canvas bag she carried. Neither spoke at first. Margaret reached inside and carefully removed the wallet. "I believe this belongs to you." Charles stared at it. For a brief moment he didn't move, almost as though he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Finally, he stepped forward and accepted it with both hands. "Where did you find it?" "In the supermarket parking lot." "You drove here?" "Yes." He looked toward Frank. "She walked from the gate." Charles frowned. "Walked?" "My car stopped running." Silence settled over the room. Charles looked back at Margaret. "You could have waited until morning." "I could have." "Why didn't you?" Margaret answered honestly. "I thought if I'd lost something important, I'd want someone to bring it back tonight." Charles slowly opened the wallet. His movements were deliberate, almost cautious. He counted nothing. Instead, he immediately reached for the hidden compartment. His fingers found the old photograph. Still there. Then the silver coin. Still there. He closed his eyes, just for a second. A breath he hadn't realized he was holding escaped quietly. When he opened them again, they looked different. Softer. He glanced toward the cash, untouched. Every bill remained exactly where he had left it. Margaret stood patiently, without saying another word. Charles looked at her again. "You never opened it." She smiled gently. "I opened it enough to know who it belonged to. And the rest. I didn't think the rest belonged to me." Charles lowered his eyes to the silver coin resting in his palm. His mother had once told him that someday someone else would teach him the meaning of those engraved words. For years, he had assumed she meant a business partner, a mentor, perhaps even his own son. He had never imagined it might be a supermarket cashier earning $9 an hour. He looked back toward Margaret. For the first time in many years, Charles Bennett found himself struggling to find the right words. Charles Bennett stood silently, the worn leather wallet resting in both hands, as though it were far more fragile than it appeared. For nearly half a minute, no one spoke. The fire crackled softly in the stone fireplace. Outside, the wind rustled the oak trees surrounding the farmhouse. Margaret remained where she was, tired enough to feel the ache in every muscle, yet calm enough to wait without filling the silence. Charles finally opened the wallet again. This time he did it slowly, not because he doubted her, because he almost didn't trust his own eyes. He removed the faded photograph first. His thumb brushed lightly across the smiling face of his mother. Her name had been Eleanor Bennett. She had died 31 years earlier, but in this photograph she was only 56, laughing at something Charles had said while they repaired an old fence together. He remembered that afternoon perfectly. She had insisted he stop working long enough to eat peach pie. He had complained there wasn't time. She had laughed. There will always be another fence. There won't always be another afternoon. He had never forgotten those words. For years, the photograph had traveled everywhere with him. Board meetings, airports, construction sites, business dinners, even overseas. It had become less a photograph than a quiet reminder that success meant very little if it cost every meaningful moment along the way. He slipped it carefully back into its place. Then he reached for the silver coin. Its surface reflected the warm glow of the fire. Character is what you carry when nobody is watching. The engraved sentence had become almost invisible from decades of being rubbed by his thumb. He smiled faintly. His mother had given it to him the day he purchased his first used delivery truck. She had pressed the coin into his hand and said, "I can't leave you money. I can't leave you land. But I can leave you something people will spend their whole lives trying to buy." He had laughed. "What?" She had closed his fingers around the coin. "Your name. Protected." He hadn't fully understood until years later. Charles looked back inside the wallet. The cash remained untouched, every credit card, every receipt, every folded piece of paper. Exactly as he had left them. He looked toward Margaret again. "You didn't even rearrange anything." She smiled gently. "I tried not to." He nodded slowly. "I noticed." Silence settled once more. Frank quietly excused himself, sensing that the conversation no longer required security. As the door closed behind him, Charles motioned toward a nearby chair. "Please." "Sit down." Margaret hesitated. "I don't want to keep you." "I insist." She carefully lowered herself into one of the leather chairs near the fireplace. Only then did she realize how exhausted she truly was. Charles remained standing for another moment before taking the chair opposite her. For the first time since entering the room, they looked at one another, not as strangers connected by a misplaced wallet, but simply as two people carrying different versions of the same long day. "I owe you an apology," Charles said. Margaret looked surprised. "For what?" "When Frank radioed the gate, I assumed you had come here expecting something." She understood immediately. "A reward." He nodded. "I'm ashamed to admit it." Margaret smiled kindly. "I probably would have thought the same." "No, you wouldn't." She laughed softly. "You don't know me." "I know enough." Another silence followed. This one felt lighter. Charles leaned back. "What made you drive here tonight?" "There was no emergency phone number." "So you could have waited until morning." "I could have." But I kept thinking about the photograph. His expression changed slightly. You noticed it. I did. My mother. I guessed. Margaret folded her hands in her lap. My mother died 9 years ago. Charles listened quietly. I only have a few photographs of her. If I lost one... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Charles understood, better than she realized. He looked toward the family photographs covering the walls. When my mother died, I spent months afraid I'd forget the sound of her voice. Margaret nodded. I know that feeling. I still replay conversations in my head because I'm afraid one day they'll disappear. Charles looked down at the coin in his hand. So do I. For a brief moment, wealth, age, status, and circumstance disappeared. Only grief remained. Shared. Recognizable. Human. Charles broke the silence. What does your father do? He used to own a small repair garage. Used to. He has Parkinson's. Charles lowered his eyes. I'm sorry. He still tries to fix things. He just doesn't always win anymore. Charles understood that sentence as well. There were battles money couldn't negotiate. He glanced toward Margaret's shoes. Only now did he notice the worn soles. One lace had been knotted halfway because it had broken months earlier. Her jeans had been neatly repaired near one knee. Nothing about her appearance suggested carelessness, only careful survival. His eyes drifted toward the window. Frank mentioned your car. It stopped about half a mile from the gate. It happens. You sound used to it. Margaret laughed. I know which noises to worry about. You learned from your father. She smiled. The best mechanic in Franklin County. Charles smiled for the first time that evening. My mother always said mechanics and teachers leave the world better than they found it. Margaret tilted her head. Why mechanics? They fix things everyone else depends on. She liked that answer. Charles slowly reached into his wallet again. He removed a thick bundle of cash. Please. Margaret immediately shook her head. No, you haven't even heard me. I don't need to. You spent your own fuel. You gave up your evening. Your car broke down. You walked. You deserve... She interrupted gently. I returned your wallet. I didn't sell it back to you. Charles fell silent. No one had ever answered him that way. Not employees, not executives, not even business partners. Margaret continued softly. If you pay me for doing what my mother taught me was right, it starts feeling like I only did it because I expected the money. He slowly lowered the cash. Her words landed harder than she knew, because somewhere inside him he had already assumed that every kindness eventually came with a price. Margaret had quietly dismantled that belief with a single sentence. Charles looked into the fire, then back at the woman sitting across from him. You've given me back something tonight. She smiled. Your wallet. He shook his head. No. My mother would say that was the easy part. Margaret looked at him curiously. Then what? Charles held up the silver coin. This. He paused. And what it was supposed to remind me of. For the first time in many years, Charles Bennett realized he had spent far too much time protecting his fortune and far too little time protecting the lesson engraved on the coin he carried every day. For several quiet moments, neither Margaret Wilson nor Charles Bennett spoke. The silence no longer felt awkward. It felt honest. The fire continued its slow rhythm inside the stone fireplace, filling the room with gentle warmth that Margaret hadn't realized she had been missing all evening. Charles looked again at the bundle of cash still resting in his hand. Without another word, he slid it back into the wallet. Margaret noticed. She appreciated that he hadn't insisted. Too many people believed gratitude had to be measured in dollars. Her mother had believed the opposite. Real gratitude, Sarah Wilson used to say, changed the way people treated the next stranger they met. Charles carefully closed the wallet and placed it on the coffee table between them. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "Were you ever tempted?" Margaret answered with surprising honesty. "Yes." Charles looked up. "I appreciate the truth." She nodded. "I'd be lying if I said otherwise. My checking account has less than $30. My father's medication needs to be picked up tomorrow morning. My car barely made it here." She smiled faintly. "So, yes." For about 5 seconds, I imagined how much easier life would be. Charles didn't interrupt. But then I imagined someone opening that wallet tomorrow and discovering the photograph was gone. She looked toward the family portraits on the wall. It couldn't be the reason somebody lost their last piece of home. Charles lowered his eyes. The answer struck him harder than if she had claimed she'd never been tempted at all. Temptation wasn't what defined a person. Choice was. A soft knock interrupted them. The housekeeper, an elderly woman named Helen Foster, stepped into the room. "I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Bennett." He turned. "Yes, I made fresh coffee. And there are still a few slices of peach pie." Charles smiled. "My mother's recipe." Helen nodded. "As always." He looked toward Margaret. "Would you stay for a few minutes?" "You've earned at least a cup of coffee." Margaret hesitated. "I really should get home." "Please. It's the least I can offer." She thought of her father. He would still be awake, probably pretending to watch television, probably checking the window every few minutes. Still, 1 cup of coffee wouldn't change much. She nodded. "I'd like that." Helen returned a moment later carrying a tray. 2 mugs, fresh coffee, 2 generous slices of peach pie. The aroma immediately filled the room. Margaret smiled. "It smells exactly like my mother's." Charles looked surprised. "She made peach pie. Every October. Mine too." For the first time that evening, both of them laughed. It wasn't loud, just genuine. Helen quietly disappeared again. Charles picked up his fork. "My mother insisted pie should never be eaten in silence." Margaret smiled. "Mine used to say dessert was God's reminder that difficult days eventually end." Charles laughed. "I like your mother's version better." They ate quietly for a few moments. Margaret closed her eyes after the first bite. "This is wonderful." Helen still follows the original recipe. "My mother never wrote measurements. Only instructions like..." He smiled. "Enough cinnamon to make the kitchen smell welcoming." Margaret laughed. "My mom measured vanilla with her heart, too." The conversation drifted naturally. Not toward business, toward family, toward ordinary memories, toward the people who had shaped them. After a while, Charles leaned back. "What did your father repair?" "Mostly older cars. He believed every machine deserved one more chance before being replaced." Charles smiled. "He would have liked my first truck. It barely survived long enough to become my second truck." Margaret laughed. "Dad would have kept it running." "I'm sure he would have." Charles looked thoughtfully toward the window. "You know, I grew up fixing fences. My mother hated throwing anything away. If a chair broke, we repaired it. If a roof leaked, we climbed onto the roof. If a neighbor needed help, we postponed our own work." He looked back at Margaret. "Somewhere along the way, I stopped living like that," Margaret answered softly. "Life gets loud." He nodded. "Too loud." Another silence settled between them. This one carried reflection instead of uncertainty. Suddenly, Charles remembered something. "Frank said your car stopped." Margaret sighed. "I think it's the alternator. Or maybe something worse." You sound like you've diagnosed it already. I've listened to enough engines. Charles stood. Come with me. She looked confused. Where? The garage. Moments later, they walked across the courtyard toward a large brick building beside the farmhouse. The overhead lights flickered on automatically. Margaret stopped in the doorway. She hadn't expected anything like this. Instead of expensive sports cars lined up in perfect rows, the garage contained history. A restored 1968 Ford pickup, an old Chevrolet farm truck, several antique tractors, wooden workbenches covered with carefully organized tools, shelves full of labeled jars containing bolts, washers, and spark plugs. The place smelled of motor oil and sawdust. It looked remarkably similar to the garage where her father had spent most of his life. Charles noticed her expression. My father built this. I couldn't bring myself to change it. Margaret slowly walked toward one of the workbenches. Every wrench hung in perfect order. Socket sets, old repair manuals, grease-stained shop towels. She gently ran her fingers across the wooden surface. My dad's shop looked like this. Charles smiled. My father believed if you respected your tools, they'd respect your hands. Margaret laughed. So did mine. Charles suddenly stopped walking. Two families, two completely different worlds. Yet, somehow, both had been raised by parents who believed in repairing instead of replacing. He looked at Margaret with new curiosity. What kind of car? 2004 Ford Taurus. What happened? She explained the warning light, the vibration, the final loss of power. Charles listened carefully. When she finished, he nodded slowly. I don't think it's the engine. You don't? It sounds electrical, she blinked. You know cars. He smiled for the first time without any trace of sadness. I started my company driving one. My father refused to let me hire mechanics until I learned to become one. Margaret couldn't help laughing. My dad would have approved. Charles walked toward an old pegboard and removed a flashlight. I'd like to see it. You don't have to. I know. I want to. As they stepped back outside, Margaret noticed the same black SUV parked near the driveway. Then she remembered. The SUV she had briefly noticed in the supermarket parking lot. The one that had seemed to linger before disappearing. She frowned slightly. Charles followed her gaze. What is it? I think, she paused. I'm not sure. I may have seen that SUV earlier tonight. Charles looked toward the vehicle. That's Noah's. He got home about 30 minutes before you arrived. Margaret nodded slowly. Maybe it had simply been a coincidence. Or maybe someone had been watching far longer than either of them realized. Together, they walked toward the waiting security vehicle that would take them back to the roadside where the old Taurus sat alone beneath the October moon. The security vehicle rolled slowly down the winding, private road, its headlights sweeping across rows of old oak trees that had stood on the Bennett property long before Charles Bennett had built a single trucking route. Margaret sat quietly in the passenger seat. Charles drove. Frank had offered to take them, but Charles had politely declined. I'd rather go myself. Neither of them had spoken much during the first few minutes. Neither seemed to mind. Sometimes silence carried more trust than sudden conversation. As they approached the front gate, the outline of Margaret's silver Ford Taurus came into view beneath the pale glow of the roadside lamp. The car sat exactly where she had left it. Lonely, patient, Charles parked behind it and stepped out first. Cold air rushed across the fields. He walked around the Taurus slowly, just as he had once inspected his own delivery trucks decades earlier. Margaret watched with quiet curiosity. He wasn't looking like a wealthy executive. He looked like a mechanic. He crouched beside the front wheel, ran his fingers lightly beneath the engine compartment, looked toward the battery terminals. then asked without looking up, "Would you pop the hood?" Margaret pulled the release lever. The hood lifted with a familiar metallic click. Charles raised it and held it open. For several seconds he simply listened. Not to the engine. To the night. Old mechanics often believed a person should slow down before diagnosing anything. Rushing usually created mistakes. He reached for the battery cable. It moved slightly beneath his hand. Margaret stepped closer. "What is it?" "The terminal's loose." She blinked. "That's all. I don't know yet, but it's where I'd start." He removed a small flashlight from his pocket and examined the wiring. One cable had developed a layer of corrosion. Another connection looked worn. He smiled faintly. "I have seen worse." Margaret laughed. "My father says that about almost everything." Charles looked toward her. "He sounds like a wise man." "He is. He just doesn't believe it anymore." Charles understood exactly what she meant. Illness had a way of stealing confidence before it stole strength. He tightened the battery connection by hand as much as he could. "Do you have any tools?" Margaret smiled apologetically. "A basic socket set." In the trunk, she unlocked it. Inside sat a faded red toolbox with scratches across the lid. Thomas Wilson. The name had been painted carefully in white letters years ago. Charles paused when he saw it. "You still carry his toolbox?" "I always will." She handed it to him. He opened it. Every wrench rested neatly in place. The sockets were arranged by size. Even the old shop rag had been folded. Charles smiled. "Your father believes tools should be respected." Margaret laughed. "How did you know?" "My father believed the same thing." He selected a wrench and tightened the battery terminal properly. Then he examined the alternator belt. Still intact, not perfect, but usable. He looked toward Margaret. "Try it." She climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine coughed once, twice, then started. A smile spread across her face. It started. Charles listened carefully. "Leave it running." He walked around the front once more. The idle still sounded rough, but steadier than before. He closed the hood. "I think you'll make it home." "You think?" "I wouldn't drive to California. But Columbus." He smiled. "You should be fine." Margaret stepped out of the car. "I don't know how to thank you." Charles gently wiped his hands with the old shop rag before placing it back exactly where it belonged. "You already have." She looked puzzled. "I returned a wallet." "You returned much more than that." The wind rustled through the nearby trees. Charles leaned lightly against the fender. "When I was 23, I bought my first truck. It broke down almost every week. My mother used to ride with me. She'd hand me tools while I crawled underneath." Margaret smiled. "My dad used to let me hold the flashlight." Charles laughed. And somehow the flashlight was always pointed in the wrong direction. She laughed too. He'd say, "You're lighting the ground instead of the engine." Charles stopped laughing. "My father said exactly the same thing." For a moment, both simply stared at one another. Different families, different lives, the same memories. Charles looked across the dark fields. "My parents never finished high school. So didn't mine. My father repaired tractors. My dad repaired cars. My mother cleaned houses before opening a bakery. My mom worked at the church pantry." Charles slowly shook his head. "Funny." "What is?" "We spent our whole lives in completely different worlds. And somehow, our parents taught us almost identical lessons." Margaret nodded. "I think kindness sounds the same no matter who teaches it." Those words lingered between them. Charles quietly repeated them in his mind. Kindness sounds the same. For years, he had measured people by resumes, degrees, titles, connections. Tonight, a supermarket cashier had reminded him that character often arrived wearing ordinary clothes. He glanced toward the silver coin, still resting safely inside his wallet. His mother's voice echoed through memory. If you ever meet someone who still believes these words, don't reward them. Protect them. At the time, he had misunderstood. He thought she meant financial protection, business opportunities, success. Now he wondered if she had meant something deeper. Protect their belief that honesty is worthwhile, because the world would try very hard to convince them otherwise. Margaret checked the dashboard. The warning light still glowed. She sighed. I'll have Dad look at it tomorrow. Charles smiled gently. And if he can't, she looked down. We'll figure something out. He noticed she never asked anyone else to solve her problems. Not once. She simply assumed responsibility. It reminded him painfully of his mother. She had carried burdens quietly too, sometimes too quietly. Charles reached into his coat pocket. Margaret instinctively raised a hand. I'm still not taking the cash, he smiled. I wasn't reaching for money. He pulled out a plain white business card. Unlike the elegant card inside the wallet, this one had only his name, a direct phone number, and a handwritten note across the back. He handed it to her. If your father can't repair the car, call me. Margaret looked uncertain. I don't want special treatment. It isn't. It's a recommendation. For the best independent mechanic I know. She turned the card over. On the back he had written Harold Jenkins, Jenkins Auto and Electric. He repaired every truck I owned for 30 years. He retired last year. But he still works on cars for people he likes. Margaret smiled. You already called him. Charles smiled back. I may have. She laughed softly. I suppose I can accept a phone number. I'm relieved. They stood together beneath the cold October sky. Neither realized that this simple exchange had already begun changing both of their lives. Not because one man was wealthy, not because one woman was poor, but because each had quietly reminded the other of the person they had once hoped to become. As Margaret prepared to climb back into her Taurus, Charles suddenly asked one final question. What time do you start work tomorrow? She looked at him. 7. He glanced at his watch. It was nearly midnight. You should probably get some sleep. She smiled. I was just thinking the same thing. Neither of them noticed Noah Bennett's black SUV parked farther up the private road. Its engine remained off. From a distance, Noah had watched the entire conversation without interrupting. He had expected to see a father thanking a stranger. Instead, he had witnessed something far more unusual. For the first time in years, he had seen his father smiling the way he used to smile before success had slowly taught him to distrust almost everyone. Margaret Wilson watched Charles Bennett tuck the small red toolbox carefully back into the trunk of her aging Taurus before closing it with both hands. He didn't slam it. He lowered it gently, almost instinctively, the way someone treated an object that carried more memories than value. Your father took good care of his tools, Charles said. Margaret smiled. He always said that if you respected your tools, they'd respect your work. Charles nodded. My father believed exactly the same thing. For a brief second, both of them laughed at the coincidence. It no longer felt surprising. Throughout the evening, they had discovered one unexpected similarity after another. Different incomes, different neighborhoods, different lives. Yet somehow they had both grown up in homes where character mattered more than appearances. Margaret climbed into the driver's seat. The Taurus idled unevenly but steadily. She rolled down the window halfway. Thank you. Charles rested one hand on the roof of the car. You've thanked me enough. I tightened one battery terminal. You drove 40 miles. She smiled. I still think I got the better end of the deal. Charles watched her for a moment. There was no trace of self-pity in her voice, no expectation that the evening had earned her a reward. Just quiet satisfaction that she had done what she believed was right. He hadn't encountered that kind of certainty in a long time. Drive carefully, he said. I will. And tell your father. Margaret waited. There's another mechanic in Ohio who still believes old cars deserve second chances. She laughed. He'll like that. The Taurus eased back onto the road, disappearing gradually beneath rows of maple trees until only the faint glow of its taillights remained. Charles stood in the cool night air longer than necessary. Frank walked over from the security vehicle. Everything all right, sir? Charles kept watching the road. When was the last time someone surprised you, Frank? The older guard smiled. I've got 6 grandchildren. They surprise me every weekend. Charles laughed quietly. I mean genuinely. Frank thought for a moment. It's been a while. Charles nodded. Me too. They walked slowly back toward the house. Halfway there, Noah stepped from the shadows beside his SUV. I figured you'd still be outside. Charles looked mildly surprised. Were you waiting? I was watching. Charles raised an eyebrow. You saw everything? Most of it. Noah glanced toward the road where Margaret had disappeared. Interesting woman. Charles didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, very. Father and son entered the farmhouse together. Helen had left the coffee cups untouched on the table. The fireplace still burned. Charles picked up the wallet once more before sitting down. Noah leaned against the mantel. So, how much did she ask for? Charles looked up. Nothing? Noah frowned. Nothing. Not $1. No reward. She refused one before I even offered it. Silence settled over the room. Noah slowly folded his arms. People don't usually drive 40 miles after working all day for nothing. Charles looked at the silver coin in his hand. No, they don't. Noah hesitated. Do you believe her? Charles answered immediately. I do. His son looked genuinely puzzled. After everything that's happened this year, after Reynolds, after the fraud investigation, after the lawsuits, Charles nodded. Especially after all of that, Noah sat down across from him. I don't understand. Charles turned the coin over between his fingers. When I opened that wallet, she hadn't disturbed anything. Not the cash, not the receipts, not even the order of the cards. Noah shrugged. Maybe she was careful. Charles smiled faintly. No, she was respectful. There is a difference. He handed the photograph to his son. Look at this. Noah studied it. Grandma. Charles nodded. Margaret said she drove here because she imagined someone searching for this. Not the money. The picture. Noah lowered the photograph. She said that she lost her own mother. Understanding slowly crossed Noah's face. Charles continued quietly. She recognized what couldn't be replaced. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, Noah asked, What are you going to do? Charles leaned back. I've been asking myself the same question. You can't just send flowers. No. You can't send a thank you card. No. You can't give her money. She won't accept it. Noah smiled. That leaves you in unfamiliar territory. Charles laughed softly. It certainly does. He looked toward the family photographs lining the walls. My mother hated charity that made people feel small. I remember, she always said, if you're going to help someone, leave their dignity exactly where you found it. Noah nodded slowly. I remember that, too. Charles stood and walked toward the window. Beyond the glass, the fields lay quiet beneath the moonlight. Somewhere out there, an old Taurus was carrying a tired cashier back towards a Columbus. He thought about her notebook, the careful way she folded leftovers, the repaired shoelace, the toolbox with her father's name painted on it. None of those details had asked for sympathy. They simply told the truth. A thought began forming. Not a reward, an opportunity, but only if it could be offered without compromising the very integrity he admired. He turned toward Noah. "How many applications did we receive for the Community Retail Leadership Fellowship?" Noah blinked. "The training program?" "Yes, a little over 400. "When do interviews begin?" "Next month." Charles nodded. "I want one more applicant." Noah understood immediately. "You want her in the program." "I want her to have the chance. Without special treatment." "Exactly." Noah considered it. "The fellowship is blind scored." "I know." "The interview panel doesn't know financial backgrounds." "I know." "They don't even know who recommends each applicant." Charles smiled. "That's why it works." Noah slowly returned the smile. "So she either earns it or she doesn't." Charles nodded. "And if she earns it, she'll know it was because of her ability. Not because she'd returned a wallet. Not because she met a wealthy man. Because she deserved it." Meanwhile, Margaret drove through the quiet interstate toward Columbus. The old Taurus continued humming unevenly, but it never stopped again. She felt the weight of exhaustion settling into her shoulders. Her hands ached, her eyes burned, yet something inside her felt strangely peaceful. The wallet was gone, returned, exactly where it belonged. The silver coin remained vivid in her memory. Character is what you carry when nobody is watching. She smiled. Her mother would have liked those words. By the time she pulled into the gravel driveway of the small Wilson house, it was nearly 12:40 a.m. The porch light was still on. The living room curtains shifted slightly. Thomas had been watching, just as she expected. Before she even reached the front steps, the front door opened. Thomas stood there wearing his old gray cardigan. "You made it," Margaret smiled. "I did." He looked toward the Taurus. "And the car. It complained. But it forgave me." Thomas laughed. "Sounds like a Ford." They walked inside together. The soup still sat on the stove, cold now. Thomas quietly reheated it without asking questions. He knew his daughter well enough to understand that some stories needed a warm meal before they needed words. As Margaret sat down at the kitchen table, she noticed her mother's faded notebook still lying where she had left it that morning. She opened it absent-mindedly. Tucked between 2 pages was an old handwritten note from Sarah Wilson. She had seen it dozens of times. Tonight, however, one sentence seemed to shine brighter than all the others. "The right choice rarely makes life easier the next morning. It simply makes it easier to look at yourself in the mirror." Margaret read the sentence twice before quietly closing the notebook. She had no way of knowing that less than 12 hours later, a phone call would arrive that neither she nor her father could have imagined. Margaret Wilson had slept for less than 4 hours. At 4:55 a.m., the old digital alarm clock blinked awake with its familiar soft beep. Before the second tone could sound, her hand reached across the nightstand and silenced it. For a few seconds, she simply lay still. The events of the previous evening almost felt unreal. The long drive, the broken-down Taurus, Charles Bennett, the silver coin, the peach pie, the repaired battery terminal. She wondered if she had dreamed half of it. Then she noticed the business card resting beside her notebook. Harold Jenkins, Jenkins Auto and Electric. Charles's neat handwriting covered the back. If your father can't fix it, call. It had happened, every bit of it. She dressed quietly before walking into the kitchen. Thomas was already awake. He stood at the counter carefully pouring coffee into 2 mugs. His right hand trembled enough that a few drops landed on the countertop. Before Margaret could reach for the towel, he had already wiped them away. Old habits refused to surrender. "Morning," he said. "Morning. You slept?" "A little." "You—" Thomas smiled. "I listened." "To what?" "Your car." Margaret laughed. "You heard me pull in. I hear that old Ford before it reaches the mailbox." She shook her head. "You really are impossible. I've been listening to engines for 45 years. I'd be embarrassed if I couldn't recognize my own daughters." They sat together for breakfast. Toast, scrambled eggs, coffee. Nothing fancy, nothing wasted. Thomas looked at her carefully. "So what? Tell me everything." Margaret smiled. She rarely needed encouragement to tell him the truth. Beginning with the shopping cart in the supermarket parking lot, she described every detail. Finding the wallet, the photograph, the silver coin, the drive, the engine trouble, the security gate, Charles Bennett, the conversation beside the fireplace, the peach pie, the garage, the repair. Thomas listened without interrupting. Only once did he close his eyes. When Margaret described Charles immediately checking for the photograph before looking at the cash. When she finished, the kitchen remained quiet. Finally, Thomas spoke. "You know what I heard?" Margaret looked up. "What?" "You brought home a man who had forgotten something. I returned his wallet." Thomas smiled gently. "No? You returned his memory." Margaret frowned. "What do you mean?" "He remembered his mother. He remembered who she raised him to be." Thomas stirred his coffee slowly. Money rarely changes people overnight, but memories sometimes do. Margaret considered his words. Perhaps that explained the expression on Charles's face when he held the silver coin. It hadn't looked like relief. It had looked like recognition. Thomas stood carefully. "Let's look at that car before you leave." Outside, the morning air felt crisp. Golden sunlight filtered through the maple tree above the driveway. The Taurus waited patiently where Margaret had parked it only a few hours earlier. Thomas raised the hood. He leaned closer. Listened. Watched. Then gently touched the battery connection Charles had tightened. A faint smile appeared. "Whoever worked on this knows what they're doing." Margaret smiled. "I told you. He grew up fixing trucks." Thomas nodded approvingly. "I can tell. He didn't over-tighten it. He noticed the corrosion. He left enough room that the terminal won't crack." He looked toward his daughter. "I'd like to meet him someday." Margaret laughed. "I think he'd like meeting you, too." Thomas spent another 20 minutes cleaning the battery posts and checking the charging system with an old handheld tester. When he finished, he stepped back. "It'll keep running. For now. For now, the alternator's getting tired. So am I." They both laughed. "You've probably got another few months. Maybe longer." Margaret hugged him. "I'll save up." "You always do." She glanced at her watch. "I've got to go." As she climbed into the driver's seat, Thomas knocked lightly on the window. She rolled it halfway down. "You forgot something." He handed her the folded turkey sandwich she had left in the refrigerator. "Lunch." "I almost forgot. You always remember everyone else." "Sometimes you need someone to remember you." She smiled warmly. "I love you." "I know. Drive safely." "I will." Oak Ridge Market looked exactly as it always did at 7 o'clock in the morning. Delivery trucks unloaded produce. Employees gathered shopping carts. Fresh bread filled the bakery with warmth. Life had continued exactly as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Margaret clocked in. Rebecca spotted her almost immediately. "You made it." "Barely." Rebecca looked toward the parking lot. "The car. It survived. I was honestly expecting a tow truck. So was I. Daniel walked over carrying a clipboard. "Morning, Margaret." "Morning. Everything work out?" She nodded. I returned the wallet. Daniel smiled. "I figured you would. No reward." Margaret shook her head. "I didn't want one." Rebecca groaned dramatically. "I still think you're the strangest person I've ever met." Margaret laughed. "You tell me that at least twice a week. Because you keep earning it." The morning rush began. Customers lined up: milk, bread, coffee, cereal, bananas. Life resumed its familiar rhythm. Margaret greeted each customer with the same kindness she always had. Nothing about her work changed. Nothing about her attitude changed. If anything, she smiled a little more. At 10:17 a.m., Daniel approached quietly. "Maggie." She looked up from scanning groceries. "When you've got a minute, there's a phone call for you." "My father? I don't think so." He wouldn't say. He just asked for Margaret Wilson. Curious, she finished helping her customer before walking toward the office. Daniel handed her the cordless phone. He sounded professional. Margaret answered. "This is Margaret." A calm male voice replied. "Good morning, Miss Wilson. My name is Ethan Cole. I'm the Director of Educational Programs at the Bennett Foundation." Margaret's eyebrows lifted slightly. "I hope I'm not interrupting your work." "A little. I'll be brief. I'm calling because Mr. Charles Bennett asked whether we would consider accepting one additional application for this year's Community Retail Leadership Fellowship." Margaret remained silent. Ethan continued. "I want to make something very clear. This is not an offer. It is not a gift. It is not a guaranteed position. If you apply, your application will be anonymized. Our interview panel will never know Mr. Bennett spoke with you. You'll be evaluated under the exact same standards as every other applicant. If you are not selected, nothing changes. If you are selected, it will be because your qualifications earned it." Margaret finally spoke. "Why me?" There was a brief pause. "I asked Mr. Bennett the same question. And he said something interesting." Ethan glanced down at the handwritten note Charles had left with the application request. "He told me, I met someone who already leads without having the job title." Margaret looked through the office window toward the checkout lanes. Customers continued unloading groceries. Rebecca laughed with an elderly shopper. Daniel helped bag produce. Everything looked ordinary. Yet somehow, the future had quietly opened a door she hadn't even known existed. Ethan spoke again. "If you're interested, I'll email the application. If you're not, I'll completely understand." Margaret closed her eyes for a brief moment. Her mother's voice echoed inside her memory. Never ask for a shortcut, but never refuse an honest opportunity. She opened her eyes. "I'll apply." Ethan smiled on the other end of the line. "Good. That's exactly the answer I hoped you'd give." Margaret Wilson stood alone in the employee break room long after the phone call ended. The cordless phone rested quietly in its charging cradle, yet Ethan Cole's words continued echoing inside her mind. It is not a gift. It is not a guaranteed position. If you succeed, it will be because you earned it. She appreciated that more than she could explain. For a few seconds, she simply stared out the small window overlooking the employee parking lot. Her old silver Taurus sat beneath the same maple tree where it had been every workday for years. It looked exactly the same. Nothing about her life had changed. Not yet. Daniel knocked lightly on the open door. "Everything okay?" Margaret nodded. "I think so. You don't sound convinced." She smiled faintly. "I just got invited to apply for something." Apply. Not accepted. Just invited. Daniel leaned against the doorframe. What kind of something? She explained the phone call from the Bennett Foundation. Daniel listened carefully without interrupting. When she finished, he folded his arms. So, what's the problem? Margaret looked down. I don't know if people will think I only got the chance because I returned that wallet. Daniel answered almost immediately. People always think something. You can't build your life around guesses. She looked at him. You know what I noticed about you the first week you worked here? She shook her head. You never looked for easy shifts. You never complained when someone called in sick. You never left work for somebody else to finish. He smiled. If there's anyone in this building who's earned an opportunity, it's you. Margaret thanked him quietly before returning to register 4. The lunchtime rush had already begun. Customers lined up with sandwiches, salads, frozen dinners, and office snacks. Margaret slipped naturally back into her routine. Good afternoon. Did you find everything today? Paper or reusable? Her hands moved almost automatically. Scan, bag, smile, repeat. An elderly man reached into his pocket and accidentally dropped several coins across the floor. Without hesitation, Margaret stepped out from behind the register to help him collect them. No rush, she said. We'll get them. A young mother waiting behind him smiled. I wish more stores hired people like you. Margaret laughed softly. I think they already do. People just have difficult days. The woman nodded thoughtfully. Those words lingered with Daniel, who had overheard the conversation from nearby. Later that afternoon, Rebecca joined Margaret during their 15-minute break. So, you going to apply? Margaret unwrapped the turkey sandwich her father had packed. I think so. Rebecca leaned forward. Think. What's to think about? What if I don't belong there? Rebecca stared at her in disbelief. Maggie, you literally memorize regular customers' names. You train new cashiers without being asked. You solve problems before managers even hear about them. You've been acting like a supervisor for years. Margaret smiled. That's different. No, it's exactly the same. Rebecca took a sip of coffee. You know what your problem is. Margaret laughed. Which one? You keep confusing confidence with arrogance. Margaret frowned slightly. Rebecca continued. Believing you can do something because you've worked hard isn't arrogance. It's honesty. Margaret looked down at her sandwich. Maybe Rebecca was right. She had spent so many years trying not to expect too much that she had forgotten opportunities weren't promises. They were invitations. That evening after work, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with her father. Between them lay a printed application packet from the Bennett Foundation. Thomas adjusted his reading glasses. This is serious. It looks like it. The fellowship included 6 months of leadership training, business management classes, financial literacy, conflict resolution operations, and supervised management experience inside several retail companies. Graduates often became assistant managers or store managers. Some eventually directed entire regional operations. Margaret slowly turned the pages. I don't have a business degree, Thomas smiled. No, you have customers. She laughed. I don't think that's the same thing. I disagree. He pointed toward one section. Describe a time you solved a difficult problem. Margaret shrugged. I don't know. Thomas looked at her over his glasses. You've been solving difficult problems every day since you were 18. You just stopped noticing. For the next hour, they completed the application together. Employment history, education, references, volunteer work. When Margaret reached the essay section, she paused. What does leadership mean to you? She stared at the blank page. Thomas quietly stood. I'll make more coffee. He knew better than to answer for her. After several minutes, Margaret finally began writing. Leadership isn't standing in front, it's noticing who has quietly fallen behind. It's treating every person with the same respect whether they can change your life or not. It's choosing responsibility before recognition. It's understanding that trust is built in ordinary moments long before extraordinary ones arrive. She stopped, read the paragraph again, then smiled. Those words sounded less like something she had written and more like something her parents had spent 33 years teaching. 3 days later, her application was submitted. Life returned to normal, or as normal as life ever became. Margaret continued working early shifts. Thomas continued repairing small engines in the garage whenever his hands allowed. The Taurus continued starting on the second attempt every morning. Nothing dramatic happened. No special treatment arrived. No mysterious phone calls, no shortcuts. Weeks passed. Autumn slowly surrendered to early winter. Then, one Thursday afternoon, an email appeared. Subject: Community Retail Leadership Fellowship Interview Invitation. Margaret stared at the screen. Her pulse quickened. She opened it. Congratulations. After an anonymous review process, you have been selected for the interview stage. She immediately looked toward the signature. Ethan Cole. Nothing else. No mention of Charles Bennett, no special note, exactly as promised. That evening, she told Thomas. He smiled quietly. You earned the interview. I only earned the chance. He nodded proudly. That's how every worthwhile journey begins. Interview day arrived sooner than expected. The Bennett Foundation occupied a modern brick building on the opposite side of Columbus. Margaret wore the only business outfit she owned. A navy blazer she had purchased second-hand 3 years earlier, black slacks, simple shoes polished the night before. She sat in the waiting room beside 12 other applicants. Some held business degrees. Others had years of management experience. Several wore expensive suits. Margaret suddenly felt very small. Then she remembered something her mother once said before every school recital. You don't have to be the loudest person in the room. You only have to be the truest version of yourself. Her name was called. She entered the interview room. 3 evaluators sat behind a long table. 1 woman, 2 men. None of them looked familiar. Charles Bennett wasn't there, exactly as promised. One interviewer smiled warmly. Good morning, Miss Wilson. Tell us about yourself. Margaret took one steady breath. Then she began. Not with the wallet, not with Charles Bennett, not with anything extraordinary. She began with her parents, a mechanic, a church volunteer, a little house on East Weber Road, a supermarket register, and the belief that every customer deserved to leave feeling that someone had actually seen them. Yeah, unknown to Margaret. Behind a one-way observation window in another room, Charles Bennett and Ethan Cole watched the interview in complete silence. Charles had insisted on only one condition. He would never speak, he would never interfere, he would simply watch. Because whatever happened next had to belong entirely to Margaret. Margaret Wilson folded her hands loosely in her lap as the interview panel looked over her application one final time. The room was quiet enough that she could hear the faint hum of the heating vents. 3 interviewers sat across from her. Linda Ramirez, Regional Operations Director. Michael Donovan, Vice President of Human Resources for a national retail chain. Ethan Cole, Director of Educational Programs for the Bennett Foundation. Although Ethan had spoken to her once on the phone, his expression revealed nothing. He treated her exactly as he treated every other applicant who had walked into the room that day. Linda smiled first. Miss Wilson, thank you for being here. Thank you for inviting me. Michael leaned forward. You've worked as a cashier for almost 11 years. Why haven't you pursued management before now? Margaret answered honestly. I thought management belonged to people with degrees, and now she smiled. I've started wondering if leadership might begin before the title does. Michael nodded thoughtfully. Linda asked the next question. Tell us about a difficult customer. Margaret laughed softly. I've had thousands. The panel laughed with her. She continued. I stopped trying to win arguments years ago. What do you try to win? Trust. Linda tilted her head. Can you explain? Margaret nodded. When people raise their voices, they're usually trying to tell you about a problem much older than the one standing in front of you. I can't fix every problem, but I can make sure they don't leave feeling invisible. Michael made a note on his paper. Ethan remained silent. The interview continued for nearly an hour. Questions about conflict, scheduling, inventory, budgeting, employee motivation, ethics. Margaret answered some confidently, others less so. Whenever she didn't know something, she admitted it instead of pretending. I haven't done that before, but I'd like to learn. By the time she left the room, she felt strangely peaceful. She had given honest answers. Nothing more, nothing less. Outside, snowflakes drifted gently across the parking lot. It was the first snowfall of the season. Margaret smiled. Her mother had loved first snowfalls. She whispered almost automatically, "You would have liked today." Across the building, behind the observation glass, Charles Bennett remained standing long after Margaret walked away. Ethan joined him. "What do you think?" Charles answered quietly. "I think my mother would have hired her." Ethan smiled. "That's not exactly our evaluation process." "I know." "So," Ethan opened the scoring sheets. "The interviewers don't know who she is. They've never met her. They scored independently." He handed Charles the summary. Margaret Wilson, average score, 97 out of 100. Highest among every applicant. Charles read the number twice. Then he quietly smiled. "She earned it." Ethan nodded. "I told you she would have to." Charles folded the paper carefully. "I never doubted her." A week later, Margaret's phone rang just after dinner. Thomas answered first. "Wilson residence." A cheerful voice introduced herself. "This is Linda Ramirez from the Community Retail Leadership Fellowship." Thomas immediately covered the receiver. "Maggie!" "It's for you." Margaret wiped her hands on a kitchen towel before taking the phone. "Hello, Miss Wilson. I'm pleased to tell you that you've been selected for this year's fellowship." Margaret closed her eyes. For several seconds, she couldn't speak. Linda laughed gently. "Are you still there?" "Yes." "I'm sorry. I wasn't expecting—" She stopped. Actually, she hadn't known what to expect. "You earned the highest interview score this year." Margaret blinked. "The highest? Congratulations. We're looking forward to working with you." After the call ended, she simply stood in the kitchen holding the silent phone. Thomas smiled. "Well," she looked at him. "I got in." He opened his arms. She hugged him tightly. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Several months passed. The fellowship proved far more demanding than Margaret had imagined. She studied operations management during the mornings, worked afternoon shifts at Oak Ridge Market, completed leadership projects at night, then returned home to help her father. There were evenings when she fell asleep over textbooks, mornings when she questioned whether she belonged there. Yet every time she struggled, she remembered the sentence engraved on the silver coin. "Character is what you carry when nobody is watching." No one watched her studying at 2 a.m. No one watched her practicing difficult conversations in front of the bathroom mirror. No one watched her reviewing financial reports while waiting for laundry to finish. Those moments mattered anyway. Halfway through the program, each fellow received responsibility for managing a struggling retail location. Margaret was assigned to the smallest store in the group. Several participants quietly viewed it as the least desirable placement. Margaret saw something different. She saw employees who looked exhausted, customers who no longer smiled, shelves that reflected discouragement rather than care. It reminded her of places she understood. On her first morning, she gathered the staff together. There were only 12 employees. "I don't know everything," she began, "but I do know this. No customer should ever leave feeling ignored, and no employee should feel invisible while serving everyone else." The room remained silent. Then one elderly stock clerk quietly nodded. For the next 3 months, Margaret changed very little about the store itself. Instead, she changed conversations. Managers learned employees' names. Birthdays were remembered. Schedules became fairer. Suggestions were actually heard. Customers were greeted instead of processed. Break rooms were cleaned. Thank you notes appeared unexpectedly in lockers. Slowly, something remarkable happened. Sales increased. Employee turnover dropped. Customer satisfaction climbed higher than anyone expected. Linda Ramirez visited one afternoon to review the results. She walked through the aisles unnoticed, watching, listening. When she finally met Margaret in the office, she smiled. "You didn't fix this store." Margaret looked confused. "I didn't." "You fixed the people." Several weeks later, the fellowship graduation ceremony filled a modest auditorium. Families applauded from the audience. Thomas sat proudly in the second row, wearing the same gray suit he had owned for nearly 15 years. His hands still trembled. His smile did not. Charles Bennett arrived quietly and took a seat near the back. He had attended every graduation for the past decade. This one somehow felt different. When the awards were announced, Margaret received recognition for outstanding leadership through service. She accepted the plaque with visible surprise. Then stepped to the microphone. "I don't think leadership begins with promotions." She looked toward the audience. "I think it begins the moment we decide another person's dignity matters as much as our own. My parents taught me that. They never managed companies. They managed to stay kind. I've spent the rest of my life trying to deserve what they gave me." The auditorium stood in applause. Charles remained seated for only a moment. Then he quietly joined everyone else. As he clapped, he realized something unexpected. The woman who had returned his wallet months earlier no longer needed an opportunity. She had already become exactly the kind of leader his mother had hoped the world would never stop producing. 2 years passed more quickly than either Margaret Wilson or Charles Bennett could have imagined. The old Oak Ridge market, where Margaret had once spent long days behind Register 4, still stood on the same corner, its automatic doors opening and closing for hundreds of ordinary people every day. Only one thing had changed. Margaret no longer stood behind the register. She walked the aisles with a clipboard tucked beneath one arm, greeting customers by name, helping employees solve problems, stocking shelves when someone called in sick, and stepping behind a checkout lane whenever the lines became too long. Her office door remained open almost every hour she worked. On the wall behind her desk hung no expensive awards. Instead, there were 3 simple items. A faded photograph of Sarah Wilson smiling in the church kitchen. A photograph of Thomas standing proudly beside his repaired Ford Taurus after finally replacing the alternator himself. And inside a small glass frame rested an old silver coin. Character is what you carry when nobody is watching. Charles had insisted the coin belonged with her. Margaret had argued for nearly 10 minutes. "It belongs to your family," Charles had smiled. "My mother gave it to me. I'm giving it to someone who still lives by it." Eventually, she accepted. Not as a gift, as a responsibility. Thomas's health continued to decline, but more slowly than doctors had predicted. He still visited the store every Friday afternoon. Not because he needed groceries, because he enjoyed watching his daughter without telling her. He would wander through the hardware aisle they had recently added, pretending to compare flashlights while secretly observing the way Margaret spoke to employees. She never raised her voice. She never hurried someone who needed extra time. She never asked another person to do something she refused to do herself. One Friday, he quietly told Daniel Brooks, now retired but visiting the store, she doesn't realize it. Daniel smiled. Real leaders usually don't. That same afternoon, a 17-year-old part-time employee named Lucas Turner hurried across the parking lot carrying a stack of shopping carts. Lucas had started working 3 months earlier. He was polite, hardworking, and painfully shy. Margaret often saw something of her younger self in him. He lived with his grandmother after losing both parents in a traffic accident several years earlier. Money was tight. College seemed impossibly far away. Still, he never complained. As Lucas gathered the final cart near the handicapped parking spaces, something caught his eye. A black leather wallet, almost identical to the one Margaret had found years before. He looked around. The lot was busy. Cars came and went. No one appeared to be searching. Lucas picked it up. His heart immediately began racing. Inside were several $1,000s. Credit cards, business cards, family photographs. For a long moment, he simply stared. His grandmother's electric bill sat unpaid on the kitchen table. Their refrigerator had broken the previous week. His sneakers had holes near both heels. The money could solve many problems. He quietly closed the wallet, then slipped it into his apron pocket, not to keep it, to think. From her office window, Margaret happened to notice Lucas standing unusually still beside the cart return. Something about his posture reminded her of another October night. She walked outside. "Everything okay?" Lucas looked startled. Oh, yeah, I think so." Margaret smiled gently. "You don't sound sure." He slowly removed the wallet. "I found this." She accepted it carefully. Without opening it, she asked only one question. "What do you think you should do?" Lucas lowered his eyes. "I already know. But knowing and doing aren't always the same." Margaret nodded. "No, they aren't." Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Lucas admitted quietly, "I thought about the money." Margaret smiled. "So did I." He looked surprised. "You did?" "When I found one like this, I had $28 in my bank account. My dad needed medicine. My car barely ran." Lucas stared at her. "You still returned it?" "I did." "Why?" Margaret looked toward the framed silver coin visible through her office window. "Because I wanted to be able to recognize myself the next morning." Lucas looked at the wallet again. "I think I understand." "No?" She smiled gently. "I think you already did." He nodded once. Then together they walked to the customer service desk. The wallet belonged to an elderly veteran who returned less than 20 minutes later in visible panic. When he realized everything remained untouched, tears filled his eyes. "I thought I'd lost my wife's picture." He hugged Lucas tightly, then reached for several $100 bills. Lucas immediately stepped back. "No, sir. I can't." The elderly man looked confused. "Please." "You saved me." Lucas smiled. "I'm just bringing home something that already belonged to you." Standing several feet away, Margaret felt tears gathering unexpectedly. The words sounded almost identical to what she herself had once said. Not rehearsed, not taught, simply passed forward. Later that evening, after the store had closed, Charles Bennett stopped by unexpectedly. He still visited every few months. Never with an announcement. Never as the owner of a foundation. Simply as a customer buying groceries. Margaret told him about Lucas. Charles listened quietly, then looked toward the silver coin inside its frame. It happened again. Margaret smiled. It did. Charles laughed softly. My mother would have liked that. So would mine. They stood together near the front windows, watching employees head home beneath the parking lot lights. Charles finally broke the silence. You know, I used to think wealth meant leaving something valuable behind. And now, he smiled, I think it means leaving behind people who make better decisions because they met you. Margaret looked toward Lucas, locking shopping carts for the night. I think that's the only investment that keeps growing. Charles nodded. I agree. Before leaving, he paused beside the framed silver coin. I don't miss carrying it anymore. Margaret looked at him. No, he smiled warmly. I know exactly where it belongs. Long after Charles drove away, Margaret switched off the office lights. Only the glow from the parking lot remained. She paused one final time before the framed coin. Character is what you carry when nobody is watching. She smiled, then locked the office door. Outside, another shopping cart slowly rolled across the parking lot in the evening breeze. Without thinking, Lucas hurried after it. Margaret laughed quietly. Some habits deserve to be passed from one generation to the next. Most people believe kindness becomes easier when life becomes comfortable. The truth is often the opposite. The hardest acts of honesty usually come when we have the strongest reasons to compromise them. Margaret didn't return a wallet because she had plenty. She returned it when she had almost nothing. That single decision didn't magically erase her struggles, but it protected something far more valuable than money, her character. The remarkable part of this story isn't that a wealthy man noticed a cashier. It's that two people from completely different worlds reminded each other of lessons they had nearly forgotten. One rediscovered trust. The other discovered that integrity can open doors without ever asking for favors. And the greatest ending wasn't a promotion or a new career. It was watching kindness continue through someone else. That's how real change happens. One honest choice becomes another, then another, until strangers begin carrying forward values they never knew they were learning. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what lesson stayed with you the most. Your stories inspire this community more than you know. If you enjoy heartfelt stories about ordinary people making extraordinary choices, please consider sharing this video with someone you care about and subscribing so you won't miss the next journey.